The courtroom was an architectural marvel. It could even be called that by human standards. The room, shaped like an enormous hexagonal dome, had floating platforms for the alien officials to hover on, while lesser species were confined to the cold metal floor. The walls pulsated with faint, bioluminescent colors that reacted to the emotions within the room. It felt both clinical and alive, an unnerving combination for the lone human girl standing in the center of the chamber. Clad in a simple, worn-out jumpsuit that barely protected her from the chill in the air, Sarah Hansen stood facing a towering alien judge. His name was Judge Koreth, a species known as the Krylorians. His kind were known for their stern adherence to rules and a complete lack of empathy, or so it was widely believed. The Krylorians had thin, elongated bodies with skin resembling shimmering emerald scales, and their eyes were large and devoid of any visible emotion. Koreth was no exception. His gaze held a cold, calculated sharpness that made Sarah feel exposed and insignificant. Sarah had been brought to trial for breaching an intergalactic law one she hadn't even known existed. As a young engineer working on a deep space mining station, she had only been trying to fix a critical error in the reactor when the system had malfunctioned. A few moments of delay had led to an explosion that destroyed the station's external defenses, leaving it vulnerable to attack. Unfortunately for her, the aliens on the Galactic Council believed this was no accident, but sabotage a covert human plot to undermine the alien authority in this part of the galaxy. Human Sarah Hansen, do you have anything to say in your defense? Koreth's voice boomed, his deep, growling tone reverberating through the hall. It was amplified by a translation device, though Sarah understood the weight of his words without it. Sarah swallowed hard. What could she say that would convince these aliens that she hadn't meant any harm? That it was all just a mistake? Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, feeling small, fragile, and helpless. I didn't mean for any of it to happen, she stammered, her voice wavering slightly. It was an accident, a malfunction. I did everything I could to stop it from getting worse. She was rambling, desperate to convey her innocence. Koreth's dark, reflective eyes bore into her, as if dissecting each word for hidden meaning. He remained silent for a long, uncomfortable moment, then finally spoke. The evidence, human, suggests otherwise. You were the only one in charge of the system that failed. The loss of the station's defenses resulted in a major breach of security. Sarah felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. This wasn't going well. She had been the sole human on the station at the time of the malfunction, responsible for overseeing the reactor system, but there had been no sabotage. She was sure of it. Yet the weight of alien suspicion pressed down on her like a physical force. The defense will proceed, Koreth added, gesturing toward the alien prosecuting team. The Caraxay race of insectoid creatures known for their meticulous attention to detail stepped forward. They moved with a clicking grace, their multi-jointed limbs making strange, mechanical sounds as they approached the center of the room. The lead prosecutor, a tall and spindly figure, unfolded a holographic display of data that filled the courtroom with a cold, bluish light. This human was the only operator of the reactor during the incident. The prosecutor began in a rapid, clicking voice. Her actions or inactions caused the system to overload, leading to catastrophic damage to the external defenses of the mining station. Sarah watched as the display showed the exact moment the reactor panel malfunctioned. She remembered it vividly, the sparks, the heat, the frantic scrambling to shut down the system before it spiraled out of control. Her hands had been shaking then, much like they were now, and in the chaos, a crucial sequence had been delayed. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain that she had done everything within her power, but the words felt weak. The evidence was damning. There she was, standing before the panel as it short-circuited. It didn't help that in the moment of the blast, she had been thrown against the wall, unconscious for several hours before the rescue team found her. By then, the damage had been done. The lead prosecutor clicked once more, concluding his statement. The defendant's actions have endangered not only the station but the stability of the entire sector. We request maximum punishment. Maximum punishment. The words echoed in Sarah's mind like a death sentence. She didn't even know what that entailed in this strange court. She had heard rumors of penal colonies, of forced labor on inhospitable planets, or worse, genetic modifications that turned prisoners into living tools for alien industries. A shudder ran through her body. Judge Koreth glanced at her again, his expression still unreadable. Do you have any final words before we proceed with sentencing, human? The room fell deathly quiet. All eyes, all lenses, all optical devices were on her. Sarah's thoughts raced, her vision blurred with panic. She had nothing left to say, nothing that would change the outcome of this trial. The aliens didn't care about her side of the story. They only cared about the damage that had been done, and she was their scapegoat. But then, in the midst of her swirling anxiety, Sarah felt a strange pang in her stomach. It was an absurd thought, but she realized she hadn't eaten in what felt like days. The constant interrogations, the fear, the isolation, it had all worn her down to the point where basic human needs had been forgotten. And now, in this moment, the hunger gnawed at her. I'm hungry, she blurted out, not even realizing she had spoken until the words hung in the air like a strange, fragile balloon. The silence deepened, thickened. The prosecutor paused, blinking with its many eyes. Judge Koretha's head tilted slightly, his expression no longer neutral but curious, as though the concept of hunger was somehow foreign to him. Hungry? Koreth repeated, his voice quieter now, as if he were testing the word. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. Of all the things to say, why had she mentioned that? Hunger wasn't a defense, it wasn't even relevant to the trial, and yet, she had said it. Yes, she mumbled, her voice small, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes on her. I haven't eaten in, I don't know how long. I'm starving. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with confusion and disbelief. The alien prosecutors exchanged bewildered glances, while the other officials whispered among themselves in their various native tongues. Then, to Sarah's utter shock, Judge Koreth stood, his towering figure casting a long shadow over the courtroom. This trial will be postponed, he declared, his voice resonating through the chamber with the authority of a king. The human is in need of sustenance. I will personally oversee her nutrition. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a wave. Sarah's heart raced. What had just happened? Why had this alien judge who moments ago seemed ready to convict her suddenly shifted focus to her hunger? The alien attendant scrambled to follow Koretha's orders, activating consoles and summoning drones. Meanwhile, Sarah stood frozen in disbelief, her stomach now growling more loudly in the silence of the courtroom. Judge Koreth turned his gaze back to her, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. You will be fed, human. And once you are no longer in a state of hunger, the trial will resume. And with that, the doors to the courtroom swung open, and a series of drones escorted Sarah out, leaving the rest of the aliens in stunned silence. Chapter 2. A Strange Feast. As Sarah was led out of the grand courtroom by the drones, the gravity of what had just happened was still sinking in. She kept her eyes on the floor, trying to steady her breathing as the metal walls of the corridor slid past her. Behind her, the whispers of the courtroom still lingered in her mind, their incredulity at the sudden shift in proceedings a reflection of her own disbelief. Judge Koreth, the cold, calculating alien who had seemed so ready to condemn her, had just halted everything because she mentioned she was hungry. She felt a mixture of confusion and something close to relief, but it was tempered by the strange, unsettling circumstances surrounding it all. The drones, hovering smoothly around her, led her to a chamber adjacent to the courtroom. The walls here were a stark contrast to the pulsing, bioluminescent glow of the trial room. These were smooth, metallic, and sterile, devoid of the strange organic quality that the rest of the alien architecture had. There was a single table in the center, with a small, alien-looking chair. Please sit, one of the drones instructed, its voice flat and mechanical. Sarah complied, though her mind was still racing. Before she had time to think further, the door slid open with a quiet hiss, and Judge Koreth entered. He was followed by 2 alien attendants, carrying actual trays of what she assumed was food. It was hard to tell if they contained anything edible by human standards. The judge's presence immediately made the small room feel even smaller. He towered over her, his emerald scales reflecting the harsh light. His multi-lensed eyes flickered briefly to the food, and then back to her. You said you were hungry, Koreth stated, his voice no longer booming but still carrying an authority that demanded attention. In our culture, we do not allow a being to suffer in need, especially not in a court of law. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the nearest tray. It was a strange mixture of something translucent and shimmering, like liquid mercury. The other trays had substances that looked like green moss, small purple orbs, and what seemed to be a paste of sorts. What? What is this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. This is Krylorian sustenance, Koreth replied, watching her carefully. It will provide you with the necessary nutrients your body requires. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the alien food in front of her. She didn't want to offend him, but she also had no idea if her stomach could handle whatever was on these trays. But after days of not eating, she was too desperate to care. Tentatively, she picked up the spoon-like utensil and dipped it into the shimmering liquid, taking a small bite. To her surprise, it was sweet. Sweet, with an oddly savory aftertaste that reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. She took another bite, and then another, her hunger driving her forward despite her uncertainty. Koreth stood by silently, watching as she ate. His presence was unnerving, but there was something about his gaze that had changed. It wasn't just cold calculation anymore. There was curiosity, maybe even something close to compassion, though Sarah couldn't be sure. What is this trial really about? She asked after swallowing another spoonful. It feels like there's something more than just the reactor malfunction. Koreth remained silent for a moment, as if considering her question. The room was thick with tension, the quiet hum of the drones the only noise. Finally, he spoke. You are correct, he said. The trial is not solely about the malfunction. It is about the place of humanity in the larger galactic order. Your kind is new, unpredictable. There are those in the Council who fear what humans might do if given the chance. They see you as a threat. Sarah blinked, setting down the utensil. A threat? To what? To stability, Koreth said simply. To balance. The galactic order has existed for millennia, and species that disrupt that order are often seen as dangerous. But I didn't do anything on purpose, Sarah said, frustration creeping into her voice. I was just trying to fix the reactor. Koreth's gaze softened slightly, his tone becoming less rigid. I believe you, human. But there are forces at play here that go beyond the scope of this trial. Sarah's heart sank. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the situation feel even more hopeless. She was just a pawn in a larger game, one that she didn't understand and had no control over. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. I don't know how to prove that I'm not a threat. Koreth tilted his head, considering her words. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, to Sarah's astonishment, he sat down across from her, his towering frame folding into the small alien chair. There may be a way, he said quietly, but it will not be easy. Chapter 3. The Unseen Path. When the trial resumed the next day, Sarah could feel a change in the atmosphere as soon as she re-entered the courtroom. The air was heavy with tension, but it wasn't the same cold hostility that had greeted her before. Now, there was something else: curiosity, perhaps even unease. The rows of alien officials on their floating platforms still watched her with suspicion, but some of them exchanged furtive glances, as though unsure of how to proceed. Judge Koreth was already seated in his imposing chair, towering over the room with his emerald scales glistening under the pale light. His multi-lensed eyes were fixed on Sarah as she made her way to the center of the room, where she would present her defense. For a moment, she wondered if he was thinking about their conversation in the small chamber the day before about what he had said regarding humanity's place in the galaxy. But his face remained unreadable, as always. The prosecution, led by the spindly Carrack prosecutor, began their final statements. The insectoid creature clicked its mandibles together as it spoke, its voice a high-pitched, rapid series of sounds that were translated into galactic common by the floating drone near it. The evidence is irrefutable, the Carrack prosecutor declared, gesturing toward the holographic display that now floated in the middle of the courtroom. The footage showed the moment the reactor malfunctioned, sparks flying from the console as the power levels fluctuated dangerously. Sarah could be seen frantically working at the controls, trying to stabilize the system, but to no avail. The reactor overloaded, and the explosion that followed left the mining station's defenses crippled, allowing the alien attackers to breach the perimeter. Human negligence led to the loss of critical infrastructure and endangered countless lives. The prosecutor continued, its voice cold and precise. The defendant's actions, whether intentional or not, demonstrate a dangerous lack of competence. For this, she must be held accountable. The holographic footage shifted to show the aftermath of the explosion. Charred metal, destroyed equipment, and a massive breach in the station's outer hull. Sarah's stomach churned as she watched the scene replayed in front of her. She had seen the damage firsthand, but seeing it again from this perspective made her feel the weight of her failure all over again. The prosecutor turned to face the alien officials. The council must consider the implications of allowing such recklessness to go unpunished. Humans are a relatively new species in the galactic community, and their actions in this case suggest they may not be ready for the responsibility that comes with advanced technology. There it was again, the underlying accusation that this trial wasn't just about Sarah's mistake. It was about humanity as a whole. She had suspected as much, but hearing it stated so plainly in court made her feel even more helpless. This wasn't just her trial. It was a test for her entire species, and she was the one on the stand. After the prosecution finished, there was a brief pause as the hologram flickered off. All eyes turned to Sarah. It was her turn to speak, to defend herself against the mounting evidence and the unspoken prejudice that hung over the room like a dark cloud. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel her legs trembling slightly, but she forced herself to remain steady. This was her chance, her only chance, to make them understand. "I know that what happened at the station was a disaster," she began, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. "I was there. I saw the damage. I know that lives were put at risk, and I'm sorry for that." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The alien officials remained silent, their eyes, whether they were lenses, slits, or glowing orbs, locked onto her. "But I didn't cause the malfunction," she continued, her voice firm now. "It wasn't sabotage. I was trying to fix the reactor when it started to overload. I did everything I could to stop it, but I couldn't." She swallowed hard, her throat tightening as she relived the moment in her mind. The panic, the fear, the helplessness as the system spiraled out of control. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said, her voice quieter now. "I just want you to know the truth. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." There was a long, uncomfortable silence after she finished speaking. Sarah could feel the tension in the room growing, the weight of the alien official's judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. She wasn't sure if they believed her, or if they even cared, but she had said her piece. It was all she could do. Judge Koreth remained silent for several moments, his large, reflective eyes focused intently on her. Sarah could see her own reflection in them, small and fragile, standing in the middle of this vast alien courtroom. She wondered what he was thinking. Was he weighing her words, considering her fate? Or was he just biding his time before delivering the inevitable sentence? Finally, Koreth spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "The defense has made its case. The council will now deliberate." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The deliberation. This was the moment that would determine her fate. She had no idea how long it would take, or what the outcome would be, but she knew that whatever happened next was out of her control. All she could do was wait. As the alien officials began their whispered discussions, Sarah sat down in her chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What if they found her guilty? What if they sentenced her to one of those penal colonies she had heard about? What if this was the end? But there was no point in dwelling on those questions now. She had done all she could. Now, it was up to the council. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the deliberation continued. Sarah could hear snippets of conversation in languages she didn't understand, some of them sharp and accusatory, others more measured. Every now and then, one of the alien officials would glance in her direction, their expressions unreadable. She glanced up at Koreth, who was still seated in his imposing chair, watching the proceedings with an air of detached authority. His expression gave nothing away, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel less alone. It was a strange feeling, given that he had been the one presiding over her trial, but after their conversation the previous day, she couldn't shake the sense that he was more than just an impartial judge. At last, the murmurs of the council died down, and Koreth stood once more. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him as he prepared to deliver the verdict. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Chapter 4. The Verdict. The courtroom was so silent, Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, a steady thumping that seemed to echo louder with each passing second. The alien officials had finished their deliberation, and now, all attention was focused on Judge Koreth as he stood tall, his emerald-scaled form towering over the room. Human Sarah Hansen, Koreth began, his deep voice resonating through the chamber. His tone was measured, deliberate, as though each word was carefully chosen before it left his mouth. The council has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the circumstances surrounding the events aboard the mining station. Sarah clenched her hands into fists, her palms slick with sweat. This was it. Her entire future hung in the balance of this moment. She had done all she could to defend herself, to make them understand that the reactor malfunction hadn't been her fault. But would they believe her? Would they care? The prosecution has presented a compelling case, Koreth continued, his glowing eyes sweeping across the room. The damage caused by the reactor failure was significant, and the consequences of the malfunction were severe. Lives were lost. Resources were destroyed. These facts cannot be ignored. Sarah's heart sank. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, each one a nail in the coffin of her fate. This was it. They were going to find her guilty. They were going to sentence her to one of those awful penal colonies. Or worse. She could already feel the cold dread creeping up her spine. However, Koreth said, and the word cut through the silence like a blade, the defense has made a compelling case as well. Sarah blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected that. The malfunction was not the result of deliberate sabotage, Koreth continued. The evidence presented by the defense shows that the reactor was faulty, and the human, Sarah Hansen, did what she could to mitigate the damage. While her efforts were ultimately unsuccessful, they were not malicious in intent. The tension in the room shifted, the air growing thick with a mixture of confusion and anticipation. Sarah could feel the eyes of the alien officials on her, their expressions unreadable as they awaited the final judgment. The council has deliberated, Koreth said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, and we have reached a decision. Sarah held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for the words that would seal her fate. The council finds you not guilty. The words echoed in her ears, each one sinking in slowly as though her brain was struggling to process them. Not guilty. Not guilty. She had expected the worst condemnation, exile, imprisonment, but those words, they were the last thing she had anticipated. The room erupted into a flurry of shocked murmurs. The alien officials exchanged incredulous glances, some of them clearly displeased by the outcome. The Karak prosecutor clicked its mandibles in frustration, its many eyes narrowing as it turned away in defeat. Sarah felt lightheaded, as though the weight that had been pressing down on her for days had suddenly been lifted. She had been found not guilty. She wasn't going to be sent away. She wasn't going to be punished. But before she could fully grasp the relief that was washing over her, Koreth continued. However, he said, and the words sent a chill down her spine, there will be consequences. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She should have known it wouldn't be that simple. While the council finds you not guilty of sabotage, Koreth said, his voice grave, your actions, intentional or not, did result in significant damage. As such, you will be placed under probation. You will remain in Krylorian territory, under supervision, until the council determines that you are fit to return to human space. Probation. The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't a prison sentence either. It was somewhere in between. A compromise. Sarah nodded slowly, her mind still reeling from the sudden turn of events. She wasn't entirely sure what probation would entail, but at least she wasn't being sent to a penal colony. At least she had a chance. The conditions of your probation will be explained to you shortly, Koreth said, his tone softening slightly. But for now, you are dismissed. Sarah exhaled a shaky breath, her body sagging with exhaustion and relief. The trial was over. She had survived. And though her future was still uncertain, she had been given a second chance. As she stood to leave, Koreth stepped down from his platform and approached her. His massive frame cast a long shadow over her, but there was something in his gaze that was different now, something almost respectful. You showed courage today, he said quietly, his voice no longer carrying the cold authority it had during the trial. And honesty. That is something I do not often see in this courtroom. Sarah looked up at him, surprised by the sudden warmth in his words. Thank you, she managed to say, her voice hoarse with emotion. Koreth nodded once before turning away, leaving her to be escorted out of the courtroom by the drones. As she walked through the cold, sterile corridors, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She had been found not guilty. She had survived the trial. But her journey was far from over. There was still so much she didn't understand about this galaxy, about the politics and the unseen forces that had shaped her trial. And now, under probation, she would have to navigate those complexities with even greater care. But for now, Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief. She had made it through the trial. She had faced the judgment of an alien court, and she had come out on the other side. As the doors to the outside world slid open and the alien sky stretched out before her, Sarah took a deep breath. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.